I wanted to start off in talking about measures by not talking about measures at all, by talking about us. And when the global partners met in Atlanta a couple of months ago, and we spent 2 days around round tables, all talking with each other. And what I realized in the course of that was that the most important element of this whole endeavor, the thing that's going to make it work or not, is the quality of our relationships with each other. And building trust, getting to know each other, building that personal relationship with each other to get through those hard parts. And that was the beautiful thing about those 2 days in Atlanta, was that really started. That to do something like this takes a huge amount of will, personal will, social capital among us, and it's so essential. So I just want to pose the hope that we can continue in this meeting and in the future meetings to build that will. We are all here for very, very good reasons that are very close to our hearts. And I'm looking forward to meeting you all on a personal level, as well as talking about measurement, which I can do for many eons, but to getting to know you personally and building that relationship, because that's what it's really going to take. So with that, I would ask first to hear from you. So a lot of this project is about creating a new way of measuring what we're talking about, the kinds of aims of deep learning, of new pedagogies. Before I get started, I'd love to hear where you're at. What are your expectations when it comes to what new measures could be like? Before I present kind of the strategy that we've come up with, what would you expect to see? What are some of the ideas in your head when you think about new measures, of what those would look like, feel like, etc.? Could I ask each of the country cluster leads to just take a second, throw up your hand and say, what are some of the top of mind things that come to your mind when, I know, tough question to start off with, but I'm sure you guys have given this some thought. Lisa, do you have any ideas?
We've been talking a lot about how do we take the measures down to something tangible at the classroom level that can really go across the system.
Mm-hmm.
That would like being not just be the end result, but what's happening to get to that result, like around engagement.
Mm-hmm.
But the things that could tangibly be looked at across 400 schools.
400 schools.
So that's scalable, as Bill said earlier.
Right, right.
Measures that are scalable, but at the classroom level.
Right, right. Good, good. Anything from Latvia or Norway? Mm-hmm. That's right. It's a critical question, yes. Yeah?
Okay. I'm mentioning something about collaborative learning.
Mm-hmm.
Not just direct measures of collaborative learning in classes,
Mm-hmm.
but also how to make something that will be as a formative tool for teachers,
Mm-hmm.
evaluating themselves, both learners and scaffolders of learning.
Fantastic. Miguel, Erica, do you want to represent what?
No, I don't want to represent. Because measurement is a complicated thing. Since we don't know how to implement yet, it's difficult to think how we will measure it.
Mm-hmm.
I like very much the measurement in the education class what the people do for society, right? For their
Education plus, the idea of what people do for society. the broader beyond just
Broader,
literacy
right,
and
but
numeracy.
it's very difficult. I had when discussing, because when we go to practical terms, right, what we're doing, this is
That's it.
fine in
Yeah.
slides, but in the real terms, the schools and how do you convince everyone and how do you do the whole thing. So I think part of the measurement will have to be as part of the other slides that Joan was doing on assessment, designing, also part collaborative with the teachers, the principals, and the authorities, right? I don't think, well, at least I don't have a way of
Clear picture yet. Yeah.
picture. Nosotros tenemos una manera, una foto de cómo lo diríamos hacer la medición nueva, Argentina no me parece que lo vio. Yo dije que en este diseño nuevo me da la sensación que hay tanta otra cosa antes que para nosotros en la medida va a construirse a medida que vamos avanzando.
Thank you.
In Colombia, we have a very specific way to measure already. We focus on measuring the process and the way every kid is going through the process of learning, rather than just evaluating the knowledge at the end of the process. So in every single point, we the educators are evaluating the process of learning. Because kids have different ways of learning. And the most important thing is what is the result at the end, because that's what they're going to use all the time. So we have specific indicators that we can share eventually. There are 4 indicators. We developed a system, an application to assess those 4 indicators. And kids, parents, educators, principals, everybody have access to those indicators, and everybody can see how they're going. At the kid student level, at the group of student level, at the grade level, at the school level, and as the district level.
Wow. Yeah. Good. I'm going to ask the Australian folks to pause because I have some predictions about what you might say, and I'll ask you to feed into some of the things I'll be saying too. Super. Anybody else want to throw out some of their ideas existing that are the starting place? Yeah.
Well, so this is what Thomas is working on some micro-credentialing projects for teachers and professional development. And so it's not as much a measure of what's happening in the classroom, but a peer assessment, or a peer-to-peer assessment, and also expert assessment of like which teachers are gaining deeper learning strategies and which are implementing them successfully in classrooms, and how can you sort of show that to the community as a teacher?
Okay.
And share that with your peers. That's
It's peer assessment, but among teachers.
Yeah,
Okay.
peer assessment, and also by teachers who have already demonstrated that
Okay.
they have that.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you. That's super helpful, and also can be, I think, we'll see some of these ideas reflected in what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the strategy as we've designed it and developed it so far. The only people who have seen this strategy so far is a group of New Measures advisors that I presented it to on the phone last week and got their feedback on. As everybody's been saying, this is a partnership. So as you hear what the new strategy plan is right now, if we go through the next hour and there's no changes in it based on what you say, we probably failed. So I need your feedback. I need your thinking hard about whether you can do the things I'm talking about, or whether this makes sense, whether in your view this is going to really get to the heart of supporting deep learning, okay? So as I go through any element of this, if it doesn't make sense, it's complicated. I'll say from the beginning, it's complicated. So if there's anything that doesn't make sense, bring it up. If there's anything you disagree with, please. If there's any additional ideas you have to help build this out, bring them all up. I'm very, very happy with the dialogue. I'm not very happy with the monologue, my own. Let me also tell you a little bit about me and where this is coming from, because I'm not a traditional education researcher. I'm a sociologist that jumped out of my PhD to go into high tech, okay? Random choice. It had to do with a lot of various reasons. The day I hit high tech, people started giving me things to do. Go create a plan for building this marketing tool on technology. I had no idea what to do. I joined Microsoft day one. They said, go construct a research strategy for figuring out what our messaging around intellectual property should be. I was like, what's intellectual property? So I was very much jumped into the world that our students are needing to jump into today. And I had to learn on the ground how to run, how to create things, the kinds of skills, all of what we're talking about. I spent about 5 years, actually 10 years in total in high tech, figuring out those skills, looking at it from a sociologist's point of view of how do you really operate in a knowledge-based society. So when I build strategies, when I come to education, it's from that perspective, from looking at it from the knowledge-based organization and what kinds of skills, what kinds of experiences do people need to be able to thrive if they don't hit the ground running and fail a lot, as I did in those first 10 years in high tech. So it's a different perspective. It's not a traditional education background. And along the way, I was a sociologist, so I was using research, but not just to measure things. I was trying to use research to drive decision making. In places like Microsoft, studying issues of corporate image globally across 40 countries to say, how do we use measurement to drive strategies? So it wasn't just measuring for measuring's sake, it was always measuring to build some kind of capacity. So that's the way I look at using measurement tools, and that's going to inform where I'm going with this. So when we started thinking about how we wanted to use measurement, it was in support of capacity building. It wasn't just to measure outcomes. It's really about, first and foremost, using measurement to support deep learning and measuring both the inputs in terms of teaching practices, in terms of system conditions, in relation to the kinds of outcomes we hope to see. The other objectives we have talked about are things like using very agile measurement systems, which means basically making as much of it online as we can so that the costs of doing measures go down dramatically and the speed with which we can do measurement increases dramatically. We also take as a principle behind this that we want to have measurement be formative at all layers of the system, from the system level to the school level to the teacher level to the task level. At every level, measuring and making it formative back to decision makers. And then finally, using some of the measures for research purposes so we can build theory out of the evidence base, not starting with the theory, ending with the theory. So what we're talking about in terms of the overall picture, we've seen this model before. The idea is that we start with a series of inputs. We're starting to try to drive pedagogical capacities, driving change leadership, the leadership roles of leaders at the school, at the system level, and building partnership capacities as well across all layers of this system towards the goals of changing practices, changing learning conditions, and changing learning outcomes. Let me pause for a second. Is this making sense? Is it confusing? So really looking at measurement from a whole system perspective, not just looking at students, not just looking at teachers, but how do changes in all these things change practices, change student aspirations and engagement, all the conditions that make up the larger learning environment, student-teacher partnerships, pedagogical practices, collaborative practices across all layers, resources, climate, how resources are distributed, and then also looking at outcomes, which I'll speak to more in a second. So when we talk about that pedagogical layer, measuring the state of new learning partnerships? What are the roles of teachers? What are the roles of students? How much are, so these are the kinds of things we would include in surveys, etc. What kinds of deep learning tasks are taking on by collecting those tasks, analyzing the tasks, and then looking at how digital tools and resources are used, but really in support of partnerships and deep learning tasks, not studying digital tools and resources in isolation, okay? So we're doing, the plan right now is to pay a great deal of attention throughout our measurements in how learning tasks are designed, okay? We're doing this, so when I talk about a deep learning task, the kinds of projects like the Wingspan project, those are going to be very varied by subject, by age, by country, by curricular goals, etc. So how do we assess deep learning competencies across all those different types of tasks, different levels, different layers? Big question. So what this chart shows is it's the findings from a research project that we're building on for this work. This project was called Innovative Teaching and Learning Research, and I was the global director of it over the last 5 years. And what we did was we collected learning tasks, over 4,000 of them, from across 8 countries, countries ranging from Senegal and Indonesia to Finland and Australia, so a wide variety of countries involved. And we developed a set of rubrics, a way of assessing the learning tasks according to deep learning competencies. So things like collaboration, real world problem solving. And we coded the learning tasks according to those rubrics. We also collected student work products. When those tasks were done, what kind of student work was produced? And we coded those student work samples by the same rubrics or parallel rubrics for student work. So what we see from this analysis is that when learning tasks are designed in a way that try to elicit deep learning skills, student work can and does demonstrate those skills. So what we see, so if a learning task scored a 3 on knowledge construction, there was a very high likelihood that the student work would also score a 3 on knowledge construction. But what you see from this is that there's very few examples of learning tasks or student work that score high on these, meaning that teachers were not able to design tasks that elicited these skills in a very deep way. Okay, they just didn't have the concrete understanding of what it meant to design a learning task with deep knowledge construction, with deep collaboration, right? Those are not inherently obvious things to do. So what this shows us is that when learning tasks are designed in a way that elicit these skills, students can develop these skills, but it's all about the design of the learning tasks. So that's where our focus in terms of capacity building is centered around helping teachers and students working together to redesign learning tasks in ways that build really deep opportunities for this kind of competency development. This is pretty complex. Does it make sense so far? Do you guys agree with it in terms of, yeah? How did we standardize competencies? So that's where, so see these little stars here? That's where we have rubrics that we developed over about a 5-year time span internationally to define what these things mean, and developed 1 to 4 scales on what different levels of those competencies mean. Okay, this is from the ITL research project, and those rubrics are now called 21st Century Learning Design. So that gives us a starting place for starting to define these competencies. We don't have to use those as they are currently defined, but they do give us a starting place, and a starting place that is very well validated. These rubrics have been used now in over 15 countries. And what happened was we found out that when teachers started coding using these rubrics, the teachers who were doing the coding of the learning tasks started to say, when I if I look at this one learning task, and if I changed it in this way, it would be a 4 on this deep learning competencies rather than the current 2 it is now. So it gave teachers a very concrete scaffold for redesigning their learning activities. And that's when we discovered, oh, this should not just be a research tool, this should be a professional development program, a capacity building program. And that's what it's turned into internationally, and what they've been deploying in Australia and some other places around the world for about the last 18 months. And that's why I'm asking the Australians to speak a little bit more about that in a moment. Do you want to go ahead and tell us what you've done, how you've implemented this 21st century learning design in a way that helps teachers transfer their the design of their deep learning tasks? Sure.
What we found, we had a problem in that people were talking about 21st century learning and saying, what is collaborate, we want devices, we want things to happen, but practice wasn't changing. People were just nodding and saying, yes, it's really important. You could run workshops and people would rattle off 21st century skills and then the little bit of saying, but they weren't actually moving on in their classrooms.
Thanks, Lynn. And so, I guess Maria introduced me, or I was introduced to Maria about 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and introduced to the 21 CLD framework, which was then under another name. What we have done since is produce a program that the bottom tagline for all of this is rhetoric to reality, and it takes the last 25 or 30 years of talking about 21st century skills and produces a framework that in our experience, after a one-day workshop, teachers can go back to their classroom and with assistance initially and some coaching, actually build learning activities that are critically designed and allow students to then build these competencies. The emerging evidences of that for us around building teacher capacity are significant and really promising. I'd like to pick up on a leader's point from before. I think around measurement here, our premise is if we build teacher capacity and change practice, that we will see an influence on student outcomes. But I think that is a layered and time-bound approach. So we're at the stage where we're certainly measuring shift in teacher practice, and I'm thinking that over the next 12 months we will start to see some emerging evidences of influence on student outcomes.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yep, exactly. I mean, the critical point is through this, we're not just looking at the learning task. We're looking at the learning task in relation to student work, in relation to student behaviors. So the idea is to have rubrics for both the task and the student work that gets produced. Because as we've all been talking about, that what matters is students' opportunity to do real things in the real world, right? So what all this aims towards is providing learning tasks that allow and require students to do that. Mm-hmm.
I think as well, there's been a lot of talk about what is 21st century skills. And the most important thing that this does is, or not the most, but one of the most important things it does is gives the teachers a common terminology and a common understanding of what this is and how they can work with it progressively. And that's what we've seen is a huge advantage.
Exactly.
I'm going to add one more point for you, and that is that
Michael's earlier comment about the importance of 2013, we have spent a lot of time over the last few years in talking about 21st century skills, attempting to conceptualise them, point one. Point two, attempting to define them. Point three, working on learning continua, i.e. a developmental sequence. Point four, gathering some empirical evidence that the learning continua is in fact valid. Now, the truth is that simultaneously we've been working on our best guesses at what the appropriate tasks might be that access higher levels of these competencies and the kind of behaviours that in fact are exhibited. So what I am really equally as enthusiastic about 2013-14 is if you go down that list of competencies, right now the two countries that have the strongest learning continua around the areas of critical thinking and around the area of creativity are Singapore and Hong Kong. They're in advance of any other country in developing that learning continua. When I look at character, South Korea would be at the leading edge of work in that space at the moment. If you think about collaboration, for the first time in 2015 PISA, we're going to have problem solving, collaborative problem solving in a digital environment. So we're actually going to get data for the first time about what this looks like. So the point I'm trying to make is that all of us from different angles are working on the measurement issue, but the point of entry into that is to make sure we're conceptually strong, definitionally strong, and that the learning continua are really starting to get tested in a way where in fact we feel confident about that. And at the moment in Australia, for example, Max and Lynn were just reminding me that they're taking this work and applying it to the 7 general capabilities that we've developed through the Australian curriculum, which, by the way, are not too far removed from most other people's in this room, including the most recent British Columbia work, which is fantastic. So it just strikes me that, I'm going back to the argument, there's an inevitability that we are going to get there, and we are in absolutely the right space to accelerate and strengthen this work. That's part of the value proposition, which I thought I'd just insert now in case I forget it at the end of the day.
Value prop. We need the Spanish translation of value proposition, though. We haven't figured that one out yet. Thank you, Tony. So the idea here is that we start with some of the rubrics and the definitions that include indicators at each level. So for collaboration, what is a 1, 2, 3, 4? And then we start through you to collect samples of tasks and student work and start to form a rich database of what student work samples in particular look like for different subject domain areas, for different progression levels, so that this becomes a 3-dimensional type of database with levels of the skills and then exemplars of the skills that really represent, and this can be done at the country level or at the global level, but those exemplars, as you've seen today, when you can show examples of really powerful deep learning tasks, when you can show examples of really powerful student work, it really works to get people's attention, to get the excitement, to get the engagement, etc. That's the idea here. Doing this in a commonly comparable way with some kind of conceptual consistency underlying it, that is the challenge, right? As these guys say, the greatest challenges for transformative assessment is to design new, robust, comprehensible, and publicly acceptable means of scoring student work, right? With the really different array of kinds of deep learning tasks, having some kind of system where we can look at those tasks and look at the student work that gets produced along some common criteria, that those criteria are defined by deep learning competencies, that's what this strategy aims to do at a global level. So what this means in terms of measurements is that we will collect, that the idea is that we would collect practices in the forms of collection of deep learning tasks, likely having teachers submit them via a template online. collecting student work products. That could be an essay, it could be a video, it could be a vast array of types of student work products. And again, collecting them probably online. Exactly how we do that's got to be worked out. Then measuring conditions through online surveys. And online surveys with students, with teachers, with school leaders, with system leaders, with parents. And also less frequently. So we try to do this pretty frequently, the collection and coding of tasks and student work, to make it part of the natural collaborative inquiry process, part of the capacity building. So that looking at our deep learning task in terms of deep competencies becomes part of the everyday practice of schools. And then less frequently gathering up collections of student work that have probably already been coded or assessed at the school level, but examining those more robustly by research teams or having the coding validated at a system level to give us some measurement outcomes at the system level. So having samples of student work coded at the, collecting a sample of them, say from each school for different grade levels, etc., and having that coding validated. It's a very different way of looking at assessment. Very much an embedded in the learning task type of assessment. It's an authentic, so that it's true to what the goals, the learning goals of a specific task are, but looking at them in terms of a common set of deep learning competencies. Questions, ideas, thoughts, puzzled brows. I'll keep going and we'll come back to this, okay? Because especially this part, none of this is set in stone. What we're talking about doing is challenging in terms of getting it done. It's got a simple sort of face to it, and it also very well connects with the capacity building model. But it's not the...
Forgive me for just one more contribution here, but there's been a lot of new, like new leadership, new measures, new learning. Well, I think it's absolutely brilliant conceptualisation of the way in which we should be thinking about new measures. But one point that goes to the heart of how you communicate this to others is that if they don't have an understanding of new assessment, they will still be stuck in a paradigm where assessment is around just for code purposes, standardised tests.
That's right.
So in other words, if one says that at the heart of this is a view of assessment, which is formative, identifying where a young person is on a learning continuum and how we can successfully move them from that point to another, then it strikes me that we've got the right entry point to have the conversation about new measures, and then you can push the conversation further about what measures do we now wish to value, which is your point about the deep learning competencies. Now, many people in this room say, yeah, fine, Tony, that's kind of like 101 entry point. But I have to say that for a lot of people, they will not enter this conversation at new measures, not even at new assessment, not even at new learning. They are still somewhere else. So I just want to make the clear...
Absolutely critical.
You know what I mean?
Can we make this story to policymakers? That's the critical key point here. Yeah.
I have a comment as well.
I think that because you said that the center, I mean, not you, but the team in general, what we're discussing here, it's the center is the student, right? And we are measuring the tasks or the activities that the educators are creating for the students. However, I would invite you and the group to think of the learning process of the student as we do, because the learning tasks are extremely important.
That's right.
We have that for every country we work with.
That's right.
However, the most important thing is the way that each kid goes through the process of learning.
Yeah.
And I don't see that in the measurement.
Good point, good point. two things there. One is that the idea is that part of this would be students co-constructing deep learning tasks. So involving, that would be appropriate not for everybody from the beginning, but that should be an element in measuring practices, the degree to which students are themselves constructing their own deep learning tasks or in partnership with teachers. But I think the Uber point bears more thinking about too, is how do we connect students' aspirations and engagement to this whole model more directly? Yeah.
And to come back with some insights from what we've observed, when teachers use the rubrics to construct a learning activity that requires students to go through a learning process, that process then is much more rigorous because it's underpinned by, at the most simplistic level, a set of 4 levels or layers of performance, if you like. So what we've seen is that when learning activities are constructed at, for example, a code 4, which requires it to be this, and this, then the thinking and learning processes that a student needs to undertake to successfully complete that learning activity are well scaffolded and incremental almost in terms of process. The other thing that we're doing is putting the rubrics in students' hands. So saying before you formatively or summatively submit this learning activity, then cast your eye over the rubric that's in front of you and see where you think you sit in terms of whichever dimensions are appropriate for this learning activity. And then have a look at where you might need to be and how you could get there. So it is all about process, and certainly the word formative that's come up is critical, and it's not in any way despite using the word measurement, in our experience, a summative thing.
And one other thought I had, an idea, which didn't make it into the final draft because we were trying to, we also know we have a balance here between complexity and doability, and but the potential for here to have a measure that we construct of students' mastery of the learning process. So some kind of assessment of students' ability to design, execute, assess their own learning cycle. I don't have a clear picture yet of exactly how we would construct that, but it would be an ideal outcome for students to be able to guide their own learning, drive their own learning over time. Mm-hmm.
We have that in our process. We can discuss it later.
Absolutely. That's another thing I want to highlight here. The content of all this is not, we're going to pull on sources that already exist. Hopefully many sources that are coming from you in this room, like Erica just pulled out. So if you have things that you're already using or that you think are powerful, or think, whether they're yours or somebody else's, please feed them in to me so that we can incorporate elements of it as we build out the actual methods. So when I said before what we're talking about is, what we wanted to do is provide a starting place for measurements that was actually doable, that you can implement realistically given all the existing demands and constraints on schools and your systems. So what we are suggesting initially, phase 1, is to really get started on the surveys first of learning conditions. These will focus on the learning conditions, and then starting collecting and coding tasks and student work. Now, why start on surveys first? Because of the political question. Because we all know we operate in a political context, and those surveys, we need to start measuring those before or at the very beginning of capacity building, because the surveys is to show change, right? So we want to show an impact, and to do that best, we start surveys before we've really done anything. Those surveys can also serve the function of starting to have a common language among all the stakeholders in the system. And the further thing I'll show you is feedback reports. Once those surveys, if we can get teachers, students, school leaders, etc., to really do the surveys the first time and very immediately give them feedback, give them measures, give them reports that really show them what this stuff is supposed to mean, then it starts to get them thinking, how can we improve these measures? And also it gives your policymakers a much clearer quantitative picture. That quantitative element, measuring student engagement, etc., gives a real, with as much fuzziness as there is around these concepts, having those surveys, that content that really clearly defined crisply and some real quantitative measures that are comparable across systems. Not that we would be doing any, country comparisons. The goal for every cluster, for every school, is to make progress, not to compare against one another, but it's to make progress. But that's why we would start with the surveys first. Mhm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's absolutely other ways to. Yeah, no. For all these things, there's a lot of different ways we could measure them. We can, ask you guys to collect all your documents and code them. It was my sense, and working on these things a long time, that surveys are the biggest bang for the buck, that you're going to get commonality of measures, you're going to be able to have, and what I'm talking about surveys, we would be very, very disciplined about creating very short surveys, especially for students, 15 minutes tops, so that the ask from all your groups is relatively small initially. Okay. So what would schools actually do? So all students, all teachers, school leaders, system leaders would start the surveys. We'd ask that they do these surveys at least annually, maybe more frequently for capacity building. You would be able to choose when everybody takes the surveys, what works with your system, but we would try to get an early baseline measure of all the through the surveys before the real capacity building work with your school starts. Then the second thing would be to start collecting and coding the learning tasks and the student work, and to start with the teachers that are trained first, or teachers that go through the capacity building, and that will be different for every country. Then over time, so this we would try to get started in the next 6 to 7 months, and then assessment work on more of an annual cycle where we collect and code a smaller sample of the student tasks or student work samples and get the coding of those validated. We'd also like to consider other means of outcome assessments. We've talked with OECD about running PISA-based tests for schools as a kind of outcome summative measure, but those aren't going to be ready online until 2016. And I think a 3-year cycle for any kind of summative measure is about, my sense is, what we're all aiming for, to have less frequent high-stakes exams. And then we can also pull in other assessments, other kinds of measures over time, but starting with something that's very doable and concrete is the idea. Questions, comments, thoughts? So this is where the gold will be, is not us at a global level or even at a cluster level getting all this data and seeing the measures. It's giving that data back at all levels of the system to help inform changes in practices, decision making, etc. So having, say, at a deep learning task level, a specific kind of report that measures how are students engaged in this report feeling about this? What are the student work scores across the different dimensions? Cluster reports, across schools in your clusters. where are the learning tasks falling on the different competencies? So collecting learning tasks from all teachers in your system, getting the codes and looking at how your codes are shifting on very clearly defined deep learning competencies. What's happening on student engagement, on student aspirations? What are the qualitative feedback? So that kind of reporting can be automated through this deep learning hub so that it becomes very fast and can be done by schools, by teachers, by clusters on your own time cycle, right? And then we would pull data from that for global analysis, et cetera. But this constant feedback cycle, this is what we mean formative at all layers. It's not data collection and even measurement for measurement's sake. It's really to support deep learning and the new pedagogies. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, can you somehow elaborate a little bit on the teacher's professional development that's following the process? What is expected? What is not expected to be?
So this is where the things that Joanne Quinn, Q, and I talked about where that system of capacity building and the measurement system sync up. So if you think back to her slide of the collaborative inquiry cycle, the second stage in it, well, the first stage in it was assess, and you can see how a lot of the measurements here could support the assessment, how engaged are students, et cetera. And the second step is designing deep learning tasks. So
it's completely connected to the assessment.
That's right.
That's good.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Just the way. So what Max and Lynn have been doing is using these rubrics that I've been talking about and using it as a professional development program, 21st Century Learning Design. This program is starting to take off internationally on its own, so to speak. Nobody's paying for schools or systems to take this on, but it's been seen that teachers who get a hold of the rubrics and who go through this kind of thing get really enthusiastic really fast, not just because it gives them a clearer picture of how to redesign learning, but when they do these new deep learning tasks with their students, the engagement and the excitement of the students really takes off. So it's about implementing this kind of thing at scale. Does anybody want to talk? There's only a few people in here who have experienced this, and just reading the rubrics doesn't really do it. You kind of have to see the whole picture. But we do have teams in different parts of the world that can support the clusters here that already know some of these methods, et cetera. Any other comments, questions on what I've gone through so far? So tasks, what are we talking about in terms of timeline? And this may be the biggest place where everybody says, nope, this won't work. But what we're talking about here, we're doing cluster leadership review of the overall measure strategies right now. The plan is that we would start to design the surveys in December, January in the London meeting. We would meet with your cluster measurement leads, who you will identify, hopefully, and appoint before London so that they can get a look at what we've been developing and sign off on what the content of those surveys would be in by the end of January so that we can start to pilot test them, make sure that quantitatively they're valid and reliable. Then start to put them on the online hub to get them up and rolling by May, and translated, localized, et cetera, so that you could start running these surveys in your schools with your teachers, students, et cetera, by May.
We are thinking of moving Uruguay to the north. Our holidays that are November, December, and January, right? We go back to the winter, we skip the summer. more feasible than to get these days.
So let me tell you, so this is the reaction I often get when I look at when I started doing research in education, everyone thought I was just nuts, that the time cycles I thought were realistic were just like, ah. So let me tell you, when I worked at Microsoft, the person who did most of my research was Bill and Hillary Clinton's pollster. And polling, you do a survey overnight, right? You start in the morning, you say, there's an issue, we have to address this issue. You work all day to figure out what questions you want to ask. That gets coded, it gets run overnight, and the presentation is made the next day on what are the results of that, and what's our message going to be. I know you can run surveys in 48 hours, but but that doesn't always get everybody's buy-in to the process. Yeah. What?
Have a job.
Yeah, Hillary lost. So, but I mean, the time question is not about the feasibility technically. The timing question is about how fast we as a partnership want to move, how much attention we want to give this, how much we want to make a commitment that and I'm not saying that what we design into the first round of surveys is what we're going to use for the next 3 years. We want to get 80% of the way there with the first draft or two, and we'll refine as we go.
I'm wondering, in terms of that timeline, how long will be needed to build really deep understandings of, for example, the 21 CLD rubrics with the people in this room, and then the school clusters and cohorts?
Yes, that's a much longer.
There's a lot of work to be done, and does that building of understandings need to be done before we start surveying?
Good question, because you want your surveys and your learning tasks and stuff to kind of go with each other.
So you want the purpose for the survey and everything underpinning it to be clearly understood.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this may appear like another bolt-on practice instead of something that is built in and highly connected to every school's way of working, way of being, culture, climate, school improvement planning.
Very good question.
It's a question I don't have an answer to.
A question for all of you is, given the political climate in your country, in your context, the political climate, the policymakers' support, how quickly are you going to need evidence to keep the momentum going? So we could choose to spend the next 3 years figuring out what the content of our surveys is and getting everybody really to internalize the rubrics. We could do that. We could very easily do that. And our policymakers would be going, got a lot for that investment. So that's the question. It's up to you guys. I mean, I would say let's go with a quicker turn, but it really is up to you guys of how fast you want. Yeah.
No, you're right. But, a lot has to do with when you talk with the policy and the political, right? If they're going to be satisfied of what we are measuring. And that's an issue that can be as complicated as measuring itself, right? Because many of the things we want to measure, even though, as it was said before, everyone talks about it, really, many of the politicians don't care about it, right? And unless we will pay the price of being the leaders in doing it. So I'm not sure if it matters so much. Because whatever we present as measurement, it will be more for internal use than for convincing politicians.
I kind of agree with you, but I think really one of the core things I would like to include in the survey, the quantitative system, is student engagement, measures of student engagement. Because I think that's where there are existing measures that we can pull from that are very validated. It's just a matter of pulling them into our surveys and translating them and make sure everybody uses that approach. It's also one of the fastest things we will likely have an impact on. And I can't imagine any policymaker not being interested in student engagement. Am I wrong?
No, right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
we'll definitely need results to get continued funding or some types of measures to get continued funding. But I think more importantly than that, we don't want to wait 3 years for 3 years worth of students to be sitting in archaic classrooms while we figure surveys out. So I think let's get started and shoot for something and adjust along the way. I would be curious to know what the school cycles are for the different countries. So for example, May would be a very challenging time in the U.S. school cycle for us to get great response rates for anything, really, for online surveys. So for us, we would either probably need to look at a month or so earlier or waiting until fall in order to get good response rates. So I'm kind of, and we don't need to answer that now, but it may be something to look at, is what our cycles are for getting good response rates.
I think that's a very pertinent question, and the way I was thinking about it is trying to get the system up and running by May and then having an open window, not a completely open window. I think I have it set out. Let me come back to this. Here. Surveying your groups. Beginning in May, first wave completed by July. Maybe we delay that a month or two. But it should stand in relation to your capacity building. When is your capacity building starting? Trying to get the surveys in before your capacity building starts. We're going to be all on different cycles.
For the purpose of the research design, was that will be some agreed upon for that capacity building piece? Or, I mean, I understand the flexibility for the systems and that we're all doing different things, but I guess I'm wondering if that's part of the design.
Yeah, that's where research in this program, it's up to you guys, but I think what we're saying so far is that research would take a back seat to capacity building. So that's when we're not going to design it so that everything's perfect for research purposes. We're going to really design it so that the research mechanism supports the capacity building, so that whenever your broad capacity building with your teachers in your schools starts, you just try to do the first round of your surveys pretty close before that. It could be 6 months before that, but then you would have your second cycle about 2 or 3 months after that capacity building. So at some point right after that first capacity building, because that's when you're going to have a bump. That's when you're going to have some data to show your policymakers. And I would also say, so this model of surveys, so it's not, one of the things, so I told you I did the ITL research. We had a series of different methods that we developed for that. The rubrics, the coding. Another thing was surveys of teaching practices. And some of you may have been involved in the Partners in Learning school research. What we did was take those surveys, put them online, translate them into 30 languages, and make it so that any school could run those surveys, measuring their own innovative teaching practices in their own school with an automated report at the end for free. There's been about, I don't know, do you know how many now? The last time I looked, it was about 140,000 teachers from around the world who'd participated in that system. So I have that system was not always technically perfect, and we're hoping to do it. But that's where you learn through versions, and we have a lot better picture of how to do that now. But we have experience in doing this kind of things, and those reports that come out of the surveys can be really powerful tools for your building support for the program among stakeholders outside of the school as well, among parents, because the reports, by definition, provide a language for talking about deep learning competencies.
I mean, this is where this project is very different, because what we saw with the research that Maria is referring to, which was made online, available for free to any school in 30 different languages, was that many schools took it because they thought it was interesting, and then the school leaders were never trained for strategic planning. So it was really, really difficult for them to move forward strategically and really setting the goals with their teachers, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where this project can support that kind of action, which is super important.
That's right, that's right. It's got to be system-wide support for these. I mean, you can't say that old measures of learning, old measures of teachers don't matter or are not primary until you have something very concrete to say this is what we're going to put in place. And so the sooner we can provide that, the easier it'll be to build momentum behind it. That's the idea. Okay, so I know we've got to wrap up, but so this is why the measurement leads for your clusters are an essential role. Somebody's got to be in charge at the local level of the translations, of getting your schools, of encouraging them, providing the means for them to do all this stuff, to run the surveys, to collect the tasks, to collect the student work, to do the coding. So that measurement lead role is going to be essential. And whoever that is will work in a collaboration team with me and the other measurement leads from all the clusters. That'll be a hard work. We'll meet, we will have regular meetings. They will be very, very involved in this process. Just following up, same kind of rhythm as the capacity building, and we'll share this with you. But first, I want to ask, does this strategy, based on what you've seen so far, align with your expectations? Align with what you think will work?
And I'll add to that, it's very assuring to be building off of your 5 years of work in this area rather than starting from scratch. That will be helpful in our cell to be able to talk about these rubrics and the work that you've done to this point and the refinement rather than, so I see that as a huge advantage.
Good. Erica? Do you think it's doable? Okay. All right, we we'll talk some more, but I want to hear, but you don't have to do it publicly.
It's a long conversation, that's why it's started.
Yeah, I think so. Let's continue. We can do it tonight over wine. We can have a lot more discussions over this. This is the beginning, kind of the surface scratch on a very complex kind of system. So the questions are, is this the kind of measurement system that you think will work? Is the timeline and is the feasibility realistic? Those are the essential questions. So let's keep talking about them. I know we need to probably take a break. Thank you all. I'm looking forward to working on all this stuff with you.